Hello, everyone. My name is Ken Berlin, and I'm a resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Global Energy Center. The Global Energy Center is one of 16 programs at the Atlantic Council. We have about 20 resident senior fellows and staff, and another 50, more than 50 non-resident fellows in the Global Energy Center. I am running a program at the center called Financing and Achieving Cost-Competitive Climate Solutions. One of the key aspects of that program is our analysis of the comparative cost of fossil fuel-based energy and renewable energy, and how to lower the cost of generating and delivering renewable energy. We began our work by looking at the comparative cost of generating renewable and fossil fuel-based energy. And we analyzed the metric called the levelized cost of electricity. And we're about to publish an issues brief on looking at doing a deep dive into the levelized cost of electricity. It shows that the cost of generating renewable energy is cheaper, and often far cheaper, than the cost of delivering fossil fuel-based energy, coal and natural gas. But it only covers the cost of generating that energy. It does not cover the cost of delivering that energy through the transmission and distribution system. And those costs can be considerable and can change the balance of costs between fossil fuels and renewable energy. It's a particularly important analysis now because we're at an inflection point in our transmission system. In the United States, the transmission system is old. It uses outdated technologies. It needs to be expanded. Interconnection points have to be added to the system for new sources of renewable energy. At the same time, it takes too long to build a new transmission line. In the United States, it takes on the average of 5 to 10 years. There's a recent example of a pipeline that was just approved that took 18 years to build. So what we're looking at is how we speed up that process and lower the costs and keep those costs of transmission and distribution and the rebuild of the system at as low a level as possible. We started our analysis with a program a few weeks ago on permitting and what's happening in the permitting system and what kind of reforms we can do. And today we're turning to perhaps the even more important subject of how we plan the build out of the transmission system. How do we do that as efficiently as possible? How do we do it without very, very long delays? And we have a terrific team here today to take a look at that. We have people from around the world. We have experts from around the world who will tell you their experience in this, how the systems work, what they're doing, and what best practices are. So it should be a very exciting program. We're starting off with Hannes Pfeffenberger, who is a principal at the Brattle Group. He's an economist with a background in electrical engineering and over 25 years of experience in the area of electricity market regulation and finance. He will give an introduction, and then he'll moderate a panel with 4 people on it. First, Eli Pack is the group manager of system planning at the Australian Energy Market Operator, AMO. Liam Ryan is the Chief Innovation and Planning Officer at EIR Grid and Vice Chair of the Board of ENSO-E, the European Network of Transmission System Operators for Electricity. Ahmed Maria is Director of Transmission Planning at the Independent Electricity System Operator, ISO, in Canada. And Laura Rausch is the Senior Director of Transmission Planning at the Mid-Continent Independent System Operator, MISO. So with that, let me turn it over to Hannes to give you an introduction, and Hannes will then moderate the panel. Thank you, Hannes.
Thank you so much, Ken. Good morning, good evening, everyone, depending on where you are in this world. This is a really exciting panel. We have transmission planners from all over the world, every conceivable time zone pretty much. And we are happy to make this work despite the time differences. In the US, we're investing about $25 billion in transmission every year, and have so for the last decade. Yet, interconnecting renewables to support the energy transition has become the most time-consuming and very costly effort that holds back the speed with which we can achieve our policy goals. Transmission planning and generation interconnection is really the key element of how to make that work. And that's why we can learn from around the world, from other system operators, from different approaches to planning, and how those planning efforts can speed the energy transition. In this panel, we hope to hear what changes have been made recently to the generation interconnection and transmission planning process, the extent to which proactive planning is used, how the significant uncertainties about the future are considered in the planning process, and how the long-term planning process is connected with the near-term interconnection needs. And finally, I'm hoping to hear a little bit in the discussion the extent to which planning can also get the most out of the existing grid through grid enhancing technologies and so on. But with that, let me turn it over to our first speaker, Eli Pack from Australia.
Thanks, Hannes. Hi, everyone. I'm Eli. I'm the Group Manager of System Planning at the Australian Energy Market Operator. And I was asked today to give a quick overview of how electricity planning is done in Australia. So to do that, I'll speak to our integrated system plan, which is essentially a roadmap for the decarbonisation of the electricity sector from now to 2050. Before I jump too far into that, I might just give a couple of quick remarks about Australia for anyone who's less familiar with the Australian electricity system. So in terms of size, Australia is about 95% the size of the contiguous United States area. But in terms of electricity demand, we're about half the size of Texas. So what that means is when we're building transmission lines across the country, it's often very long distances, perhaps 1,000 kilometers or 620 miles. And that means that those very long transmission projects are being funded by a relatively small number of people. So from our context, we've got great resources, but transmission can be long and expensive. So to talk about the integrated system plan, I might talk you through the journey that we've had in regulatory reform in recent years. Our chief scientist at the time, Professor Alan Finkel, he did a review of the future power system security in Australia. And he made a lot of very important recommendations, but for me, the most important, which would dictate the next several years of my life, would be about delivering an integrated system plan. And that should be done through a lot of stakeholder engagement, particularly with network service providers, and that it would develop and connect renewable energy zones. So we got this requirement, and we went out to deliver it. The first thing we needed to decide was, what is a renewable energy zone? We'd seen a couple of examples internationally. There was a competitive renewable energy zones in Texas that was well received, but there weren't too many examples, and we didn't really feel that any of the definitions out there suited our needs. So we added to that confusion by making our own definition. So we said renewable energy zones are areas where clusters of large-scale renewable energy can be developed using economies of scale. So once we had the definition down, we needed to figure, where are these renewable energy zones? And to do that, we started by looking at the resources. So the left and middle map here show wind and solar resources, with the orange and red areas being the highest quality. And the map on the right shows potential areas for development of pumped hydro resources. We started to engage with industry on these factors and very quickly found out that there are a lot of other factors that are important when you're developing projects. So we ended up with 9 factors that led to these maps here. Again, wind on the left and solar on the right, but this is not just showing the resource quality anymore. Resource quality is about 30% of the grading here. In addition to that, we scored the correlation of that resource with demand, the land parcel density. So are you engaging with a small or a large number of landowners? Land cover, so is it arid or forest area? Are there roads there? So can you get the equipment in? Is the terrain flat or complex or or mountainous? What's the population density like? Are there any natural protected areas? And how far is the electricity network? So with all those different factors, we were able to then develop and consult on a list of 41 different candidate renewable energy zones, including 4 offshore renewable energy zones. So these were effectively just areas, but for each area, we developed different network augmentation options. And for those augmentation options, we consulted publicly on the design. We showed the cost, what every transformer we selected cost, the conductors we picked, how it was switched into the network. We're very transparent with these designs. And then we looked at the resource quality, and we got 12 years of historical data for solar and wind, and we were able to project what different projects would be able to deliver between now and 2050 at a high level, using different historical reference years for those data points. We then had a lot of other information for these renewable energy zones that we published, but we published it alongside 67 different inputs and assumptions. You're not going to be able to read through this whole slide, I appreciate it, but this shows the different things that we publish. We did take a very consultative approach to developing the integrated system plan. So whenever we developed a transmission augmentation, we published it. We published our discount rates that we used, our forecasts for electric vehicle uptakes and rooftop PV, what every future generator costs and what we assume fuel costs, what we assume land costs. This was all published, and for most of these we would have a consultant report, and then we would consult on the output. So we ended up with this wealth of information that we published, and we ended up getting a lot of different questions around it because it's being used for lots of things outside of electricity sector planning. And that's helped us build the rigor around the process. But all of those inputs and assumptions and scenarios fed into this one large optimization model, and we ended up optimizing using linear programming the combination of resources and network projects that would get us from where we are today to a net zero economy in 2050. What we see in the yellow is a significant continued uptake of solar, supported by a lot of growth in wind in green. And what we see in the red dotted line is our dispatchable capacity remaining somewhat flat, even though we close down all of our coal generators and replace them with gas generation that operates in a peaking and then backup role. Some of the other key outputs from this plan are that we expect that 60% of our coal will exit the market between now and 2030, with 100% exiting by the early 2040s. While all this is going on, we're expecting electricity usage to nearly double with uptake of electric vehicles and other electrification. We're seeing a huge need for storage capacity, increasing by a factor of 30. Gradual increase in our capacity of gas generation, noting though that we're shifting from mid-merit gas to peaking, and then we expect gas to play more of a backup role, where it might not operate for even years at a time, but then could need to operate for all days or multiple days, 24/7, when we have those renewable energy droughts. We're seeing a need for grid-scale wind and solar to increase 9-fold, and the rooftop PV on people's houses to increase 5-fold. The last thing I will show here is how we've been tracking in recent years. So this shows our maximum instantaneous penetration of renewables. We've been increasing very linearly at about 6 or 7% increase in our maximum stats per year. Right now, it's just over 68% of our demand has been met by renewable electricity at one time. We do expect that to flatten out as we head towards 90 and 100%, but we've seen very good outcomes, and we've continued to see a lot of renewable energy connect, and some of the projects that we've been planning in recent years are being built now. So that is a very quick crash course in electricity planning in Australia. I'm now going to hand over to Liam from EnerGrid, who will talk about his experience. Liam?
Yep, thanks a million, Eli. Really good presentation and tough act to follow, but we'll give it a go. Today I'm here to speak to you as the NSOE Vice Chair of the Board. In that capacity, I just want to thank Atlantic Council for the opportunity to take part in this exciting event. And to bring a TSO perspective on the enduring decarbonisation of secure and sustainable transmission system. For those of you who maybe don't know what NSOE actually is, it's an association of transmission system operators. In other words, we're responsible for the secure and coordination operation of the European electricity system. And to achieve that, NSOE carries out a series of legally mandated tasks. And among one of those tasks is the coordination and planning of the development of infrastructure at a European level. NSOE was created in 2019, and it unites 39 transmission system operators for electricity, representing a power system of roughly 480,000 kilometers of lines. And we service 500 million people. So, in other words, a unified Europe in electrically speaking terms is the best way of actually thinking about it. Our members are across 35 countries in Europe, and so that goes beyond the borders of the European Union. And as I said, we're responsible for secure and the coordination of operation of the European electricity system. And it's the largest electricity interconnected grid in the world. In addition to our core kind of historic responsibilities for technical cooperation, NSOE is also like the common voice of TSOs at a European level. But today I'm really here to talk to you around how we actually plan our network, knowing that it's 35 different countries that we're actually really looking at. So the timely expansion of the transmission infrastructure is a critical component in the toolkit of achieving the climate targets that we're actually looking at. And throughout the last decade, we have developed and consolidated a tool to foresee how the electricity system will look in the years ahead. And it's called the 10-year network development plan. And that's published every 2 years. And we have huge engagement all across the sectors, all across Europe, to ensure that we have the voice of everybody included in what we're actually looking at. And despite its name of a 10-year network development plan, we've expanded it last year in 2022 to look out to 2030 and the 2040 kind of time horizons. And at the heart of how we approach the 10-year network development plan is scenarios. And we indicate how the Europe power system might look in the future. And each scenario impacts on the market and the network. And we analyze that with specific tools in relation to how we actually look out in relation to it. And then once we've actually analyzed what the market looks like, then we identify the system needs. And in there we look at increasing cross-border electricity exchange, in particular, how we would look at the electricity changing from one jurisdiction to the other, and looking at also peak capacities and really focusing on the economic benefits that brings for the future energy scenarios. And then once we've collected those kind of needs, then we identify an array of infrastructure that is required to deliver the European needs in that perspective. Here I'm showing the infrastructure that we see that's actually required. So when I look out to the 2030 kind of time horizon, we're looking at 141 transmission projects. That's cross-border transmission projects that's actually required, 23 storage projects, and 6 offshore hybrid projects to deliver a most economic European grids that we're actually looking at in that kind of time horizon. We also then, so as you can see, the scale is quite onerous over that kind of period in time that we're looking at building out. So when we look at the 10-year network development plan, you know, it was 2 years of a lot of work that actually went into it. And just kind of three main messages that really comes out from when we step back and step up from it. There's a substantial amount of room for improvement throughout all of Europe. Between 2025 and 2030, our studies find that 64 gigawatts of additional capacity on 50 borders could make economic sense. And if I look out to 2040, we're looking at 80 gigawatts of cross-border capacity, and that's on 65 different borders, and that's a 75% increase on the flow on borders than what we would see in a 2025 kind of time horizon. Also, the other kind of key message is that addressing the system needs, that when we start to look at this as an interconnected, reduces Europe's dependence on gas-based power generation. And this has been brought into sharp focus, as we're all aware, over the Ukraine crisis over the last kind of 18 months or so. And also the other kind of key kind of point or message is that to achieve the European decarbonisation targets requires cross-border and sectorial planning, as the power system is central to a full decarbonised power system into the future. When I look at the amount of interconnection and the amount of storage that we need in the system. So the lines here show the new interconnection that's actually required, and the yellow, different shades of yellow show the amount of renewables or the amount of storage that we will actually need. So in essence, what this really slide is showing is that the integration of renewable energy forces us not only to promote generation, but also to think about our existing infrastructure and to reinforce cross-border capacity than what we would have actually had over the last period in time. And that key collaboration is required over that period in time. So why are we doing this, right? And I always think about the counterfactual is the kind of the do nothing scenario. So I'm not going to drain everything on this slide because I'm just conscious of time, but not investing is costly. So investing 60 billion per year will save 3 billion in relation to generation costs. Our system will be more stable. So if we don't invest, our system will become unstable, and blackouts might become more frequent in relation to what we're trying to actually deliver over the period in time. We would not be making the most efficient use of our generation capacity. So we'll have more generation curtailment on the actual across Europe. And by investing in infrastructure, we will halve the amount of constraints that we actually have on the system. And also it will reduce our dependence on gas by about 20%. By if we don't have these investments, we will have 20% more gas than we actually have at the moment. And then also without infrastructure, we will not be able to decarbonize to the scale that we actually need to do over the next period in time. And look, we tend, as system operators, tend to think about addressing the challenge as looking at generation and new grid, but we also need to address tomorrow's challenges. Will require parallel development of a diverse range of solutions, including storage, the role of the prosumer, and also generation, in addition to reinforcing the actual grid. And our studies use interconnection just to show the needs that's actually required, but we are very much open to other solutions coming onto the system to try and fast track what we're actually looking at and trying to bring forward the solutions. And some of those could be hybrid solutions into the actual future. So I just want to conclude by just saying that we see that planning is actually at the center of achieving the actual targets. The 10-year network development plan remains a key tool from a European perspective in addressing the infrastructure that we actually need. And as TSOs, we're committed to working collaboratively together, not alone to solve our own national problems, but to solve it on a European perspective. Thank you very much. And now I'll hand over to Ahmed.
Thank you, Liam. So my name is Ahmed Maria. I'm the Director of Transmission Planning at Ontario's Independent Electricity System Operator. I'm really excited to be here, and I'm looking forward to the discussion today. So let me tell you a little bit about the IESO first. So the IESO is a government agency. We don't own any electricity infrastructure. We don't own any transmission or any generation assets, but we work at the center, at the heart of Ontario's electricity sector, and we perform a number of different functions. We're the system operator, so we balance supply for electricity with the demand for electricity on a second-by-second basis, 24/7. But more relevant to this discussion, and we perform other roles as well, but more relevant to this discussion, we're the system planner. We're the entity in Ontario that's responsible for planning the electricity system in the province. So in Ontario, electricity planning is done at multiple levels. Our local distribution companies plan the distribution networks. And so today, for the most part, the IESO doesn't get too involved in distribution system planning, but in the future, that remains to be seen. Like as distributors start using more advanced technologies like distributed energy resources in their planning, the IESO may need to get involved in distribution planning as well. But really, the IESO is involved in the other two levels of planning. So that the IESO controlled grid, or the transmission system, is planned at two levels, at a local level, and that's called, we call that the regional planning process. And for that purpose, Ontario is divided into 21 regions. We also plan at the provincial level, at the Ontario-wide level. There isn't a lot of time to talk about these two processes in detail and how they work, but the key point here is that they work together and they're well coordinated. And both processes look 20 years ahead on a periodic basis. They look at how supply for electricity is changing in the province. They look at how demand for electricity is changing in the province. They consider government policy. They look at also facilities when they're reaching their end of life. Then they integrate all of this information and identify over the next 20 years where the system issues may occur. And for the system issues that are more local in nature, we use our regional plan. We develop regional local plans for those more local issues. And then to address the issues that are more provincial in nature, we develop bulk system plans. And so the output of this process are a number of planning reports or power system plans at the local and provincial level, which recommend new transmission assets and recommend a new generation. For new generation, we work with the government to get the necessary approval to procure the generation that we need for the province. And for new transmission, we rely on the transmission owners in the province to apply to the regulator for approval to construct those facilities, and we support them in that regulatory process. So at a high level, that's the regulatory framework, and that's the planning framework in Ontario. And if planning works well, downstream processes work efficiently as well. So sorry, the lights went out. Yeah, so if the system planning works well, downstream processes will work well as well. So we have the connection assessment and approval process that is a process where we assess new connections to the grid. Ideally, the focus of those processes would be on what's required to connect the facility, and they would not discover any need for any network upgrades, because the system planning process will proactively address that. We also have, when we need to acquire resources, we also test to make sure that those resources are deliverable during system peak when we need it for resource adequacy. And so for the most part, if we did our planning correctly, the network can accommodate all the resources that we need to procure to meet our resource adequacy needs. So when system planning works well, these downstream processes won't encounter any network issues or constraints and can focus on acquiring the resources that we need and connecting them. So this process has served us well and worked very well up to this point. But with the significant change and uncertainty being created by the energy transition, we see a need to adjust the way we plan and to be a bit more proactive and more, I would say, a little bit more risk-taking in the way we plan. So before I go into that, I'll talk a little bit about what the energy transition might look like in Ontario. And fortunately, we're starting off in a pretty good spot. Thanks to a government decision made in about 20 years ago in 2001, Ontario is now retired its last coal plant in 2014. And so now 90% of the energy that we consumed in 2021, and generally 90% of the energy that we consume today, is met by clean resources, consisting of nuclear, wind, and solar and hydro. And 10% is met supplied by gas. And so really today, to decarbonize the electricity system in Ontario, we basically need to get rid of that remaining bit of gas on the system. Late last year, we did a study where we looked at a scenario in 2050 where the electricity grid is completely net zero, and we've supported the decarbonization and electrification of the Ontario economy. In that scenario, what we found is that demand for electricity will almost double from what it is today, and that we would need to connect about 69,000 megawatts of new clean generation, consisting of nuclear, wind, demand response, and hydrogen as well, to replace the gas and provide the flexibility that gas provides. We estimated that the cost of this would be about $400 billion. The capital cost of all this infrastructure would be about $400 billion. The transmission system would need to double. The land used would be about 14 times the size of the city of Toronto. So the very significant undertaking, but this is the magnitude of the change that would have to occur in Ontario in order for us to meet for Ontario to meet its decarbonization goals. And so what I'd like to conclude with is now the challenge in planning the transmission system for a change of this magnitude. And we'll talk a lot more about this in the panel, but just to introduce the ideas, what we believe is that the challenge in planning the transmission system is that it takes a long time to build it. We need to build a lot of it in order to support this energy transition. And basically and it's really uncertain also what the amount of transmission is that we need to build. Like this is just one possible scenario where we're looking at a lot of nuclear, but maybe there could be another scenario where there's a lot of hydro, or maybe not as much electrification. So there is a bit of uncertainty as well in terms of how much transmission that we need to build, in addition to the fact that it takes a long time to build it and that we need to build a lot of it. And so generally the approach that we're thinking of taking now to plan for this transition is, at first, we study as many scenarios as we possibly can in order to understand what are the range of possible transmission projects that we might need in the future to support the energy transition. Then once we have an understanding of the range of possible transmission projects that we might need, then we can start making decisions around proactively preserving land for that transmission, like corridors of land, proactively engaging in early development work and planning studies and environmental assessments to bring many of these projects as close to shovel ready as possible, so that when and if we see the need for these projects, we can move quickly to build them. Also, we want to look at pay very close attention to facilities that are reaching end of life, because that's a great opportunity to upsize the transmission system if needed. So these are some of the ideas that we're exploring for how we can evolve our planning process in order to support the energy transition. And I'll be happy to talk a lot more about that when we get to the panel discussion. So with that, I'll pass it over to Laura.
All right, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. It's a pleasure to join this panel and talk a little bit about transmission planning from a MISO perspective. So my name is Laura Rauch. I'm lead the transmission planning function at MISO. And so for those of you who are not familiar, we are a regional transmission organization in the Midwest of the United States. So we have reliability coordination services from the Canadian province of Manitoba down to the Gulf Coast states in Louisiana and Texas. We run a real-time operations 24/7 control center. We also have a full energy and ancillary service markets. And of course, for today, we coordinate regional and interregional planning, both within MISO and with our neighbors here. So from a snapshot of how MISO looks at how we plan for our future, we have a host of functions that we look at, ranging from reliability, economic, cost allocation. When we think about what's going to be required for our future, we have a core function that we call our reliability imperative. And that is, we share with our membership a joint responsibility to make sure that we maintain reliability for the system. And our goal in system planning is to make sure that we are maintaining that reliability in a way that is economic as possible, considering the resource and policy goals of our members and states. One tool that we use to do that and one framework that we use to do that is our future scenarios. So our future scenarios are intended to capture snapshots of what the future may be, knowing that no particular snapshot will actually be the correct one, but hoping to bookend the range of future possibilities that we might have. As you can see, what we are expecting to do is move from a fleet that is heavily thermal resources. So while we are in the midst of our transmission, historically we have been a very heavy coal-based, and we still have significant amounts of natural gas in our footprint, into a fleet that is much more focused on renewable energy integration, decarbonization for our members' goals. We're also are noting, even as we are doing the work to project what this future might be and to create models for it, that the rate of change and the velocity that our members would like to get to those goals is accelerating. The data you see on the chart here is from 2021. We did a refresh of our future 2, our middle scenario there, last year. And what we saw, or earlier this year, what we saw is that what we thought was our middle of the road scenario actually looks more like our most conservative scenario, and our most extreme scenario is more middle of the road now. So our members' goals are accelerating, and we are working within our planning processes to continue to support that. One way that we do that is through what we call our long-range transmission plan. This is a set of transmission to make sure that we are enabling the goals of our members. And we anticipate that it will have at least 4 tranches. Tranche 1 and 2 are groups of transmission projects that are intended to support the transmission, to provide transmission to support the policy goals of the Midwest region of our footprint. Tranche 3 is going to be focused more on the southern, the Gulf states area of our region. And then Tranche 4 will bring them all together. Tranche 1 was the first step in that, and it was approved last year. And it's an example of how these futures can translate into transmission that's needed. So this is about $10 billion in transmission investment intended to create a high voltage transmission network to serve needs across the MISO footprint, essentially the transmission equivalent of a highway for our future needs. It was built over 2 years and over 200 meetings with our stakeholders to make sure that we are considering all the needs and creating a robust situation that can accommodate multiple future scenarios. Although I mentioned that our primary focus is reliability and making sure the lights stay on, another key thing is ensuring that we are building transmission that's as efficient as possible to meet those reliability needs. And so we spent a lot of time looking at what we call our conditions precedent to transmission build out, which include policy consensus, which we capture in our future. It includes efficient cost allocation, and it also includes making sure that those benefits are commensurate with costs. And these are the benefits that we saw, or some of the benefits, I should say, we saw for Tranche 1. They range from decarbonization and lower cost for fuel, including the incorporation of lower cost resources, to decarbonization benefits. Our goal was not to prescribe that these are the benefits that everyone must see and believe in, but we intended to capture all the benefits of the transmission, and so that everyone can see the value that they will get from it in multiple different ways. And in doing so, we found that this transmission will provide benefits many times in excess of its cost, even over a 20 to 40 year lifespan. So just to wrap things up, as I mentioned at the start, we do believe that this is a journey, and Tranche 1 was a significant step in that, but it's not our final destination. We are currently working on what we're calling Tranche 2, which is that second step in the Midwest region of the MISO footprint to build transmission to support the needs of our footprint. As we continue to look at the resource fleet transition, we are noticing that the resource mix is getting much more geographically diverse, and that it's also changing in its attributes. And that is shaping the transmission needs that we see in the future, and will continue to do so. As a result, we are looking at higher voltage, while most of our footprint has, in the Midwest, has a 345 kV backbone. We are looking at incorporation of more HVDC, as well as going into more 765 kV transmission. And we're also looking at what will be required to support the new attributes of the system. We expect that's going to be a closer look at system stability, closer look at reactive power and support. And so these are the things that will frame our work going forward as we continue to move through tranche 2 to tranche 3 and beyond. And that concludes my remarks. So I believe we are moving on to the panel discussion next.
Thank you. That was very interesting. It's good to see that there's similarities across all the planning processes, but also important differences. We received a number of questions that we will get to, but just as a follow-up, each of you mentioned scenarios as part of your planning effort as a way to deal with long-term uncertainty, since we don't know where the future will actually end up in 2040 or 2050. How do you use those scenarios? Are you building the transmission for the sort of least challenging scenarios, of a least regrets type of approach? Are you building it for the most challenging scenarios, so you're ready for whatever comes? Or are you doing some sort of plan that performs well for all of the scenarios? But how are you dealing with that? Eli, do you want to start first, since you started the discussion?
Yeah, I'd love to. I'll start by saying what we used to do. So we used to take our scenarios, determine the benefits of our plan under each scenario, and then, and then we would go with the one that gave the best average. We've moved away from that in recent years, and we've moved more towards the least worst weighted regret approach, which is very complex. It's similar to a regret minimization approach like least regret, except it takes the regret from each scenario and then weights them according to the scenario likelihoods. And then we take the least worst weighted regret, which is incredibly complex. And then to add complexity, we overlay that with what's known as consumer risk preferences. So consumers may be risk averse in some instances and may prefer a plan that provides somewhat more insurance value against things like early closure announcement from coal power stations, or delays in the delivery of major projects.
Thank you. Liam?
It's a similar version, and we would use the least worst regret. So we know across all the scenarios that, there's the projects that make sense, and therefore they are progressed and are moved forward. And then we will look at how do we actually maximize the economic benefit across the jurisdictions. And that in itself drives the right projects that we're trying to actually do in the various different jurisdictions. And then, of course, we're also looking at a national level as well. That inside, so let's talk about the interconnection between the various different jurisdictions. And then at a national level, we're always looking at the least cost effect onto the end consumer, knowing that we know as we start to move into the future that it becomes very difficult to predict. But we're starting to move in Ireland now towards what we're calling a plan-led approach, where we're moving away from previously it would have been built based on developers connecting. Now we're looking at forward future, forward planning, so that we get a more holistic, better solution into the future.
Ahmed?
So I'll start off by saying it doesn't cost a lot to study different scenarios, and it doesn't take a lot of time, but it provides immense value. So our view is it doesn't hurt to study a number of different scenarios, try to understand what would be required under those different scenarios, just to inform our nearer term recommendations and decisions. And so what we would do is for a given plan, like say right today we're developing a plan for the Toronto area, and in that area it relies on a gas plant. Today it relies on a gas plant to meet local reliability needs. We don't know how long that gas plant would be there, but we know that at some future date it will probably not be there. So there's a scenario that we're looking at right now was to determine what transmission would be needed if that gas plant were to retire. And that's useful information to have. We can use it to inform policy decisions around that gas plant. But also it can help us assess our nearer term recommendations for the city. Like, so for example, we recommended something, we can ask ourselves, well, how do we view this recommendation in a scenario where this gas plant would retire and we wouldn't need and we might need something different. And so the way we use scenarios right now is mostly to help us sanity check our nearer term recommendations and to inform future policy decisions. When it comes to the energy transition, understanding what's required under the many different possible pathways to decarbonization will help us make decisions around what corridors of land we may need to protect for the future, what early development work we may need to initiate. So this is how we use scenarios today, and how we incorporate the results of the scenario analysis in our planning.
Laura?
I think, not surprisingly, there are a lot of similarities to, for Tranche 1, we did focus on the least regrets scenario, and we built a transmission portfolio focused primarily on that. As we move forward into Tranche 2 and additional transmission planning, we are focusing more of our mid-level scenario. We think that is actually closest to where we will end up. And so our base generation will be created based on that. However, as Ahmed said, it's notable to say that there are a lot of ways that we want to look at that, and it's useful to make sure that we have snapshots. So as we look at our reliability studies and what transmission lines are needed, we'll be doing additional analysis to go and look at what happens when you have a lot of wind on the system and what needs may be driven from that. Or when you have a low wind, what happens during extreme events. So even within a given, what I call a future scenario, which is your base model, you'll have a lot of sensitivities which go in and take snapshots of situations that keep our operators up at night to make sure that we have strong benefits and the ability to be not only reliable, but we can talk about resilience of the system with additional transfer, the ability to accommodate multiple different weather conditions from what we'd expect to see every day to more extreme weather scenarios.
Thank you. You also mentioned that you're planning out to 2040 or 2050. So that's 20, 30 years away, when transmission takes only 5 to 10 years to build. How do you use the sort of insights from the 20 to 30-year long-term plan to figure out which projects should be approved for construction and development now? We can go in the same order unless some of you want to jump in ahead.
I'm happy to start again then. So we certainly in Australia, we plan to 2050. We've got a national goal of reaching net zero emissions by 2050. So that's a good target to plan for. As I said earlier, we have very long transmission projects in our pipeline because Australia is a geographically large country, and some projects might take 5 to 10 years to deliver. So if we were only looking 10 years out, it would be very difficult for us to understand fully the benefits that a project might deliver if it only has a few years in the modeling horizon. So we've certainly found that over time we've had to extend the horizon of our modeling, and the scenarios that we use diverge quite significantly over that period. So we do have scenarios that are aligned with different temperature trajectories for the global sort of future. And our more ambitious scenarios have things like hydrogen development and significant amounts of electrification, while our more modest scenarios have sort of lower economic growth and more gradual energy transition. And what we're looking for in the short term is projects that perform quite well across those bookended scenarios, noting that, yeah, by the end of the horizon, we've got very different plans across those scenarios.
I think for the short term, really good question, Hannes. And look, for the short term, we need to be looking at kind of smart technologies coming onto the system, because what we're seeing is that, similar to Eli, is that when we're looking at large linear infrastructure projects, 10 years goes in the blink of an eye. And therefore, we need to be really planning that those large projects are coming on in that kind of 10-year plus horizon. And then we're constantly looking at how we upgrade our system, whether it's putting smart technologies on, or it's also using the likes of storage solutions being located in the right locations, which can be deployed much quicker to minimize the amount of infrastructure we're building, but allowing the renewable integration to be maximized. And then when we look out beyond kind of 2030, you get divergence. So you actually have very different scenarios where it's almost looking at the economies reducing in size to significantly increasing. And as Laura said earlier, the one thing we're guaranteed is we're going to get it wrong. So therefore, for some of the no regrets projects, is making sure that we're progressing those at speed and that they are a focus for us. And continuously reviewing this at regular intervals to make sure that we're still making the right decisions as we move forward. Because as new technology evolves, from a TSO perspective, we're open to bring those technologies on, which potentially could mitigate or minimize the amount of some of the infrastructure we need. But without saying, infrastructure is critical. And when we look to from an Irish perspective, we look to 2030, 80% of our electricity will come from non-synchronous renewable sources. By 2040, we're looking at potentially being a zero net carbon fully system. So the scenarios are quite different in some cases.
Perhaps one other point I'll add to this is that stakeholders and communities generally like to see where we're going the long term in addition to the near term. And so looking ahead 20, 30 years in the future, it gives them a sense of what might be needed and where we might be going in the longer term. That's in addition to the benefit of making almost sanity checking our nearer term recommendations to make sure that whatever we're recommending now is in line with where we might end up in the future. And so that's one reason why we do look that far ahead. Our stakeholders have been asking for it, like they want to understand the bigger picture.
Yeah, and just to add in, we started regional planning when we realized that a more localized view wasn't sufficient. So that we were essentially trying to band-aid our way out of bullet holes here, which is a situation that wasn't getting us to the most effective solution at the end of the day. Where we've grown now is we've realized that local and more localized and more regional transmission are not mutually exclusive. They both have to exist in harmony. There are scenarios, and the resource fleet transmission is one, where this regional viewpoint really gives you the least cost solution. And you only really get that forward vision by looking 20 years out and building to see those needs, especially when you consider these transmission lines may take 10 years to get in service, and you have generators that want to connect on them now. You have to then make sure that your local planning fits in and supports that larger scale regional plan. So we've had a lot of success in going and making sure that we are projecting out to get that most efficient value for these higher voltage one thing that we have to make sure we're keeping in mind on that is that MISO, we're not resource planners. We support and we facilitate the resource plans of our members in our states and our footprint. And so our goal is not to build to a prescribed set of generation. Our goal is, especially when we're building this long-term transmission, kind of build a super highway for it that our members can then use to support the resources that they want to build. So those are the key paradigms and key framework pieces that we use to make sure that our regional transmission, our long-term transmission maintains reliability and maintains its usefulness.
Thank you. We received a number of questions about the social license, political support, permitting processes. In your experience, to get a transmission line built, you need to plan it, somebody needs to pay for it, so one needs to figure out who pays for it, and then permitting. In a lot of discussions in the news and so on, we hear that permitting is sort of the biggest problem, at least here in the US. I'm not sure that's actually the case, because figuring out who pays for the lines and planning the lines in the first place seems to be just as challenging. In your experience, how would you rank those three P's? Is the planning, does it have to start there, and how difficult is it? Is it on cost allocation? Who pays for it? And finally, to what extent does permitting and siting the lines create a problem that needs to be addressed better? Who wants to go first?
I can start there. We always say that the best transmission is the transmission that can get built. We at MISO, we are not primary on routing and siting procedures, as are that go through by and large the state forums. And while we will support them, our utilities are the ones who are leading towards that. So I might have a little bit of a bias here. What we found is the cost allocation, the planning. I don't know whether you can put one over the other, because they really all have to be there. And so I talked about earlier the conditions precedent to transmission build. A lot of that is planning and building a business case. At the end of the day, our goal is to make sure the states have the information they need to understand, and as you go through those regulatory processes, that they hold up to the scrutiny there. So it really has to be a paired solution with planning, cost allocation, that then leads to more success on permitting at the very least. Siting is something that we simply are not as involved in, although we've seen, except for one project which has been held up in siting, most regulatory proceedings have been able to find a way to get the transmission built. And that's probably largely because we have our members in our utilities coordinating throughout to tell us to avoid certain areas that may otherwise preclude transmission build out.
In the Australian context, we've got a saying too. I like your saying, Laura, that the best transmission is the transmission that can be built. Ours is that the regulatory framework will slow you down, but social license will stop you in your tracks. And what we've found is that social license is the #1 challenge in Australia right now for building transmission. We went through a long period where we didn't build much at all across the country, and now we've identified that we need 10,000 kilometers of new transmission by 2050, and each kilometer will be its own challenge. So we've seen the state governments do various things to sort of try to grease the wheels on some of these projects. So in 3 of our biggest states, Queensland, New South Wales, and Victoria, biggest from electrical demand, we've seen new land policy come out. So we've got a Just Terms Land Acquisition Act, which talks about the appropriate framework for acquiring land through negotiation and through compulsory acquisition if it comes to it. But now a lot of projects will also get an additional $200,000 to $300,000 per kilometer Australian. So that's something like 135,000 US dollars per kilometer, in addition to what's generally considered to be the fair value. So yeah, the governments are certainly identifying this and making change, but we're still seeing significant opposition, even with some suggesting that compensation is an insult, and it's getting very tricky in some areas right now. So that's going to be our number one challenge, is social license.
I think from an Irish perspective, I agree with Eli. I think we've radically changed our engagement with communities and also the landowners. So we actually have had, historically, we might have had significant objection to some of the infrastructure. I think with the Celtic Interconnector, which we have progressed recently, we actually had no objections. And we actually had people writing in support of the actual project itself, because we were very clear in engaging with the communities at the initial concept stage. So they actually had the opportunity to help us find the best route, the best location, and identifying some challenges that we would have never found by doing our normal routing and siting challenges that we actually have had. And then that feeds into the overall planning decisions as well, that if you actually have communities that are supporting the actual projects, it then becomes much easier. Sorry, is that better? It becomes much easier. Apologies. It becomes much easier to get it through the planning consenting process. So in my mind, the two biggest challenges generally for infrastructure is planning and then also the social licensing. I think in relation to the cost allocation, I think a good regulatory framework can generally resolve those issues. And, you know, when you look at the cost of not actually having infrastructure, when you're looking at constraints, curtailment, and the cost of carbon, and the impact on society itself in the longer term and climate, it becomes a very it becomes a one-sided equation very quickly.
Thank you. I mean, we're going to say something too.
Yeah, maybe I can just quickly add that I mean, in Ontario, the ISO is responsible for identifying the transmission projects that are needed. We're not the ones that go out and build and construct it. So we wouldn't have a lot of experience with trying to get the social license to build transmission. What I could say is, like in Australia, for a very long time in Ontario, we haven't had to build any new transmission in the province. And very recently, over the last couple of years, the plans that we've released over the last couple of years have recommended over now $5 billion in new transmission to be built in Ontario to supply the agricultural sector in Western Ontario, mining growth in Northern Ontario. And in talking with the transmitters that are building these projects, we're not hearing. We're hearing that they're running into typical barriers with building new transmission, but nothing that they believe they can't handle. I think one thing that we've been hearing a lot though is the importance of creating meaningful partnerships with the Indigenous communities. And so I know that Hydro One, for example, developed this new 50-50 partnership arrangement with Indigenous communities for all new infrastructure projects that they build. So this is one area that Hydro One has advanced considerably. But for the most part, we've recommended a lot of new transmission to be built in Ontario, and it's getting built. And we're finding a way to do it.
Thank you. A lot of you talked about building new transmission capability, but we also know that our existing grid is a few decades old, sometimes more than 50 years old. To what extent do your transmission plans, the plans to add transmission capability, rely on repurposing existing infrastructure, upgrading existing right-of-ways, using retiring fossil plants for new interconnection points, going underground, for example. Where does it stand? What's the share of sort of using existing right-of-ways more cost-effective or more effectively from a capacity perspective versus building greenfield new lines?
So from, if I can jump in, maybe first of all, from an Irish perspective, we generally try to stay away from trying to build new infrastructure. We know we need to, but we're starting from the premise of repurposing the infrastructure that we currently actually have, maximizing its utilization, and then also looking at how we can deploy maybe smart technologies onto the existing infrastructure to maximize the utilization of what we actually have. And then we also look at when assets are reaching the end of their life, you know, what is the right thing to do with that asset? Is it either to retire it or to actually then repurpose it into utilizing maybe a corridor route for a different technology. And yes, we are actually looking at a lot of underground cable. So at the moment, like we actually have a major piece of work kicked off this year of looking at Dublin in particular. So we're pretty much digging up all the circuits in Dublin, and we're going to be making sure that all of those are fit for purpose for 2040, 2050 kind of time horizon. And therefore that's pretty much built into what we're actually looking at. The thought process I usually try and think of is, if I never have to build another overhead line again, isn't that really successful? I know that's not going to be the case, and we know we will have to, but it's making sure that communities see that we're utilizing everything that we actually have as much as we possibly can.
Maybe I can quickly jump in on this. In Ontario, we've been thinking a lot about how do we incorporate end-of-life planning into our transmission planning process, because we think there's a great opportunity when a transmission facility reaches its end of life to, rather than replace it like for like, to do something significantly more with it to meet our future needs. There was a study, there was a corridor, a number of transmission lines in Eastern Ontario that were reaching the end of life, and we did run a study, a one-year study, to figure out, is the best option for that to replace it like for like, or to do something different with it. Ultimately, we concluded it's to replace it like for like is the right choice at this time. But this is something that we want to do a lot more of. We've been working with our regulator, and the regulator is proposing to actually amend the license requirements of all transmission owners in Ontario, making it a requirement to provide information on when facilities reach end of life into the planning process, so that it could be accurately incorporated. So we think it's a great opportunity. The assets in Ontario are aging, and it's a great opportunity to, and when they do need to be replaced, it's a great opportunity to do something different and something more appropriate for the future.
From the Australian context, we certainly have a lot of replacement projects underway, but I would say in our sort of national plan, we've got far more greenfield than brownfield projects. One area that we are doing something quite interesting, I would say, is in our Queensland state, in that there's a Queensland Energy and Jobs Plan, which is a plan by the state government that sort of feeds into the rest of the planning frameworks across the country. And in that plan, they talk about gradually closing down the state-owned coal power stations, but replacing them with renewable energy hubs, where they might convert the coal generators to run as synchronous condensers. They'll connect batteries into the areas, and perhaps new transmission, whether it's underground or overhead, could be connected to accommodate renewable energy. They've also got a jobs component of the plan, which is key to getting communities on board. So they guarantee the jobs for workers in those power stations. And yeah, we're seeing a huge need for things like synchronous condensers and different ways of providing grid stability services. So that's one great example that I think we're seeing deliver really good outcomes in the coming years.
So with MISO perspective, we work closely with our state regulators. They're called the Organization of MISO States. And one of the things that they asked us to do was to use existing right-of-way when at all possible. So in tranche one, we were largely able to use existing right-of-way. Now, a lot of new construction, obviously $10 billion, but less land usage than we had there. Moving forward, we do think that, especially as we look at higher voltage or whether 765 or HVDC, we will be having more land usage requirements. So we do think that, but we do focus on how we can use especially existing land rather than condemning new property for the transmission build out.
Great. We also got a question that sort of fits in here, and then is, to what extent are you concerned that you might be over planning, over building the transmission system because new technologies might be coming along that could significantly reduce the need for transmission?
So I can start here. I was also involved in transmission planning at MISO when we did what we called our multi-value projects, and roughly 10 years ago. And those were transmission build out to go and make sure that we could accommodate the high levels of renewable penetration we thought at the time, which now seem quite low by comparison. What I would say is we found that really what we were worried about there was the same thing. What if we build too much transmission that doesn't end up being used and useful at the end of the day? Because we have an obligation to make sure the costs to our members are as low as possible. What we found is that we wish we would have built double the transmission then, as it would have absolutely been used and useful. So from our experience, current paradigm, transmission build out, it's a question of, at worst case, you build it a few years earlier than you might have otherwise. And I do think we have an obligation to continue to look at enhanced technology to see if that could minimize transmission build out. However, the transition of what resources we want to build cannot happen without transmission build out. You cannot have a fundamental shift from coal to distributed wind and solar resources without having lines to get them elsewhere. So while we might have less transmission as we really enhance and adopt those technologies, we do a lot of work to make sure that the transmission we build is used and useful and will be, as I think everyone's mentioned, a least regret solution.
Yeah, I work with a consumer panel who help ensure that I have a consumer perspective on these sorts of things, and they are constantly reminding me that costs are certain and benefits are uncertain. So that's one thing that we tend to keep in mind, that if we commit to a grid project and if consumers are going to fund it, they're definitely going to pay the bill, and the benefits will come if we see renewable energy connect and if it helps ensure reliability. So one general approach that we have is to try to address multiple needs with the one project. So if we're building a new interconnector between different states, we'll try to ensure that that interconnect goes through renewable energy resources, or areas with high quality renewable energy resources, so that we can connect renewables, so that we can improve our ability to share generation across the grid, and hopefully it'll be well utilized. But I do tend to agree that our projects are on average taking longer than we intend, and it will often be a matter of, if we've overbuilt, perhaps we build it a few years too early. When we look at the risk profile, the risk of not building it is typically far more significant than the risk of building it.
What we found is, if you look at the lead time required to build new transmission and the costs to build it, most of the costs are in planning, development, environmental assessments. Most of the time, is in planning, development, environmental assessments. That can take about 5 years, but the cost of that is very small. And then really all the costs are in the construction, which is the last 2 years in lead time. And so what we're exploring in Ontario is this idea of doing the development work, doing the planning work, all the environmental work, all that work, the work that will take 5 years to do, doing all of that for multiple different projects, but not committing to the construction until we know for sure the need is there. And so what that does is allows us to have the option in the future to build it if it's needed, but also the option not to spend all that money for construction if it's not needed. We did this we tried this with a transmission line in Northern Ontario, where in 2018 we did a planning study and it said if under a high growth scenario we would need this line by 2025, but under a reference scenario, base case scenario, we wouldn't need it really until 2030. So faced with that uncertain need, what we did is we actually initiated development work, but not construction. We basically said, start developing work, start spending money, planning it, get it ready, make it as shovel ready as possible. And then as we get closer to the need date, we'll let you know if we want to spend the larger amount of money to build it. And it turned out that we did need it by 2025, and we did give the signal to go ahead and build it. But this is a tactic that we're taking as well to make sure that we don't overbuild, but at the same time we don't underbuild either. Like we do this investment, try to get the projects as shovel ready as possible.
Yeah, like I would echo what my colleagues have actually said, and I think really it's as system developers and system planners, what we're continuously actually doing is monitoring the projects that we actually have in flight. So if we see new technologies that come on and negate the need from, of course we will take it on board. But I think to Laura's point earlier, I don't think there's any project that we have built that we've actually turned and had a regret around it, because we've seen that the economic growth in all our jurisdictions have increased. The technologies, we're moving from being a fossil-based fuel energy system to being now distributed, and therefore how we repurpose our existing infrastructure needs a little bit of thought. And I think it's, that element is really where the challenge comes in. And I don't think that we have overbuilt, and I don't think we are planning to overbuild. I think if we just look at the electrification of heat and transport in particular, that's going to add a significant demand onto our system. And I think some of the challenge that we actually have is making sure that we're able to show the opportunities to third parties, whether they are renewable generators connecting onto the system or large demand customers being able to connect on to different parts of our grid, that building out the grid then allows for that extra flexibility into the future as well. And it's making sure that we capitalize on that, and that government policies align with what we're trying to do from a planning system, because it does take 10 years plus to build the infrastructure that we actually need.
Thank you. We only have about 5 minutes left, so we are running out of time very quickly. I want to end up on a question, and that is, given your planning efforts in the last several years, what are the key lessons that you have learned over those last few years that you think others would benefit from, and where does your planning process need to go next, including, what have you learned from just trying to get to net zero? After all, the system is very different today than it was in the past, and it will be changing dramatically. And some of what you've been doing seems to be going towards that. But if you could summarize, what are the key lessons that you've learned, where need to go next, and how can system operators better learn from each other when it comes to these processes? I know it's a compound question. Who wants to go first?
I might just take a little part of that. So we have another expression in Australia that's, there's no transition without transmission. I would take it a step further to say there's no transmission without social license. And again, I would probably highlight that. So we've had a lot of work done to try to improve social license. Some of it has worked and some of it has definitely not worked. So what I would say is to take early and significant action towards social license is one of the biggest lessons that we've had. Another is just on energy storage. We need a significant amount of energy storage to get anywhere near net zero, and we need gas generation to back that up. So our view on, or at least my view on energy storage, is to explore all options to find deep energy storage, because we will need a lot of it.
I'll jump in next. Just in relation to, in Ireland, we're currently operating a power system where 75% of our instantaneous electricity comes from non-synchronous sources, and we're going to be pushing that up to 95% by 2030. So the key thing for me was the last 10 years was all about physics. Was the challenges around how we actually push the boundaries and we bend the laws of physics to be able to do what we're actually trying to do in very unique and clever ways. But I think over the next kind of 10 years, when we start to push the boundaries up to very high renewable penetration, it becomes about economics. And therefore, if we look at the energy market in particular, how that starts to send out the right signals and the right technologies coming onto the system. So the market needs to evolve, and that needs to really evolve with the changing technologies we have coming onto the system over the next period in time. And I think planning and how we actually plan the system is really critical for underpinning those elements. And to Eli, I think like one of the key things, and I fully agree with it, is winning the hearts and minds is going to be really critical, because we're doing this for society, and therefore we need to be bringing society along with us, and getting that social license is really critical.
So I'll add to this. Looking for ways to preserve options is important as well, without spending too much money. I think that's important given the great uncertainty that we're seeing in the future. The other thing I would add is the importance of being transparent and being very open as part of your planning. And this is useful because market participants could help provide solutions to meet our future needs. And so giving them early information can help them with that. And it will also help get the social license that we need as well.
I'll repeat a lot of the advice that our friends have given on this panel. Really getting people involved into the discussions early and often is so critical on this, from the critical regulators, because quite frankly, the best way to have costs allocated for transmission is the way that the people who are responsible for representing those, the end use load, agree to. So making sure the state regulators are in, making sure you have your consumer advocates involved early, making sure you understand all the different viewpoints of what the future can hold is so critical, just to make sure that you're building the technical response to the right issue. I think from a where are we going next, the complexity is not going to get less. It's going to continue to get harder to talk through these things. As we've talked through, the attributes of the system are changing. We're going to really all need to stretch and work together to make sure that we are finding and identifying those least cost solutions at the end of the day. And so I think the major focus will be making sure that we understand the nature of the grid that we'll be operating and planning for, and making sure that we're doing so in a proactive enough way so that we're not limiting our options on how we do that, so that we can have this very reliable, very economic system that minimizes costs to our consumers.
Thank you. Ken, back to you.
Okay, well, I want to thank all of you for speaking today. All of you are really at a really central point in the efforts to transition to a net zero economy. Sharing your insights, I think, is very helpful to everyone working on these issues. We'll follow this up at the Atlantic Council with various publications and other steps we're taking to try and help get the information out that we've learned from you and from others as we're doing this work. I'd also like to thank the Atlanta Council staff that works on this: Meyer Edwards, Graham McGillivray, Jackson Styron, Eamon Collins, and Frank Willie, helping us put this presentation together. I particularly like to thank Hannes, who played a critical role in putting this presentation together and for the role that he played today. But I want to thank all of you again individually for your work on this. As I said, we'll have a whole series of things coming out from the Atlanta Council that will build support for this in the United States, and obviously a planning process that is efficient, that is innovative, that looks to the future, that plans ahead, will make a very, very different transition. So again, I want to thank all of you for your work, and I want to thank everyone who listened to this conference today, and I hope you got a lot out of it. So thank you, everybody, and we can finish with that.